terms of astronomy. And since Doug has asked that we base the presentations on something that we've done in the past, I would like to start with some history, particularly a meeting about communicating altruism that Doug organized in Paris a long time ago. And from that, branching out to some reflections about languages and about the issues of evolution, in particular the ideas of convergent evolution and the question of what is intelligence. So starting with the Paris meeting, here we are in a funky villa in Paris. Everybody looking up as if the aliens were coming down, and any minute here landing on a convenient piece of lawn so we can talk with them about how best to send the messages of altruism. And by the heroic efforts of Doug and the inscrutability of Springer, 10 years later, finally there was a book based on that meeting, and I'll start with my contribution, which was called Images of Altruism. So images is something that I think comes naturally to most minds about sending messages. And this is, of course, altruism. It's what people also call a form of anthropomorphism, what people call heuristic anthropomorphism. We're starting with ourselves because at some point we have no other place to start. And the basic idea for this contribution was based on the philosopher of religion, Loyal Rue, who talks about how religious ideas get disseminated, both within a community and outside. And there are several strategies. The one that's relevant to images are aesthetic strategies. And this is not particularly specific to religion. It's just cultural communication. It communicate the desire for world peace or for combating hunger in the same way with exactly the same strategies. And what I want to point out here is what these aesthetic strategies basically do is that they appeal to emotions. And this appeal is, the idea behind this appeal is that there is an evolutionary background that makes them to some extent universal. Our evolutionary constitution is such that we react to images in certain ways. And so let's see how this works or how it doesn't work across different cultures. Here's a picture of Saint Martin of Tours. After I thought of him, I found out that tomorrow is his feast day, November 11, and prodigious quantities of roast goose are going to be consumed in my native country in his honor. So that tells you he's a very popular saint. There's also a famous picture by El Greco, by the way, of Saint Martin that's now temporarily on exhibit at the National Gallery in Washington. And what made him popular was that in his earlier life, before he became a bishop and then a saint, he was a Roman soldier, and what he did was cut his fancy Roman officer's cloak in half and gave half of it to a beggar. Now, the first thing you almost immediately realize that there are certain cultural problems here. First of all, this makes a much bigger impression in Minnesota, where every winter a few people freeze to death than it would be in Southern California. The other thing is, though, the relationship between the story and the iconography. The legend and the picture go together. People who know the story recognize this as a picture of St. Martin, and the people who see the picture are reminded of the story. And someone who does not know the story may not immediately know what's going on in this picture. So even among human cultures, this doesn't get us quite far enough to be considered a universal example of altruism. So one possibility that, of course, now with our technology is not as much, not as immediately obvious as it was maybe 10 years ago, was, well, we would probably send a simple picture anyway, something like the Arecibo small bitmap. And maybe these pictures are not culturally contingent. Well, unfortunately, that's not true. I mean, there can be a cultural subtext to the simplest message. So the first conclusion that the first generalization, I should say, that I made from this talk in Paris is that any image has some sort of cultural context, some that we can't get away from, even the simplest ones. But can we do better than the examples that I already used? Are there perhaps features of evolution? And of course, talking about evolution to some degree excludes sets machines, which I have to think about before I respond. The first generalization is that we can't get away from the context, but there may be ways that are, if not universal, then at least widespread enough that we have a chance to be understood. And Loyal Rue pointed particularly as the most general icon of altruism to these kind of mother and child pictures, which in this book I call it the Madonna pictures, because obviously in Western culture that's what they are arrived from. In Western culture they came originally from pictures of the Virgin Mary and Jesus here with John the Baptist, and 400 years later, this Raphael Mary Cassatt, you have exactly the same image composition except with Jenny the Baptist here instead of two male children. Now this is clearly universal among cultures. There are obviously exceptions to any kind of generalization like that, but we recognize it as a universal icon. But does it play on Andromeda? Well, I'm not really saying we should send these pictures. I'm saying we should think about these pictures in terms of what kind of message, how messages are sent and received. So the one example that we can use here is to think about actually whether this feature is universal. And there are obviously, for as Seth would say, squishy and warm beings, reasons to believe that there has to be this generational communication, and humans have evolved for completely different reasons to have a long infancy where cultural communication can take place, which is obviously important to us. We might not have developed a technological society without it. But then there are science fiction writers which have the idea that we can do without it. They can imagine aliens that can do without it. And I've used James Blish here because he was one of the first of them who worked it out in a coherent stories, but there are surely lots and lots of them. Now, going back to what Loyal Rue actually said about these strategies, these aesthetic strategies, is that they are meant to elicit emotions. And so we have to think about, is there actually reason to believe for a convergent evolution of emotions? Is that a reasonable assumption? This is an incredibly hard question to answer, and what makes it harder, considerably harder than it should be, is that we have been thinking about the wrong way for several hundred years. We have been thinking about a seesaw between reason and emotions since, well, in some ways since antiquity, but at least since the age of reason. Namely that the development of reason requires us to suppress emotions, and then, of course, whenever you say something like that, you have a reaction to it, and emotions go up and reason goes down at the expense. And Stephen Toulmin, in his book Cosmopolis, documents how this is so ingrained in our Western society that we don't think about it. This is one of the worst things that can happen, that you have a bias that you don't recognize. But in fact, it's a completely wrong way to think about the problem. Reason and emotions are not sitting on a seesaw. They do not even inhabit the same playground. But it seems that, unfortunately, aliens have the same problem, at least the fictional aliens, like Mr. Spock here, who stands on almost 2,500 years of Stoic philosophy. And Stoics, interestingly, had actually a worked out plausible theory of emotions, namely that they are appraisals of situations that are important to us and motivate a response. The Stoics just thought it was always the wrong response. But of course, if you think about evolution for a moment, that can't possibly be true, because we, especially our animal ancestors, couldn't have survived if we had be conditioned to always give the wrong response to a particular situation. Now, if we single out the life forms that are potentially communicating with us, then there are some plausible assumptions that we can make, as long as they are life forms and not machines. But we also know that there are some things that we cannot know about them. And this becomes important in context with what I said earlier about strategies. When it comes to extraterrestrials that have technology, then we are probably correct to assume that they have evolved some appendages to their body that allows them to manipulate technology. But what are the assumptions that are sort of the mental equivalent of that, the mental instruments that have evolved in such a culture? And Jerome Barco, one of the founders of evolutionary psychology, has an article in this extraterrestrial altruism book about the kinds of co-evolution that presumably go along with technology. And I can't repeat the arguments here, but there are some plausible social behaviors that are necessary to develop the technology. But what we need to remember is that we cannot see emotions. We cannot tell what fear feels like even to a dog very well, let alone to an extraterrestrial. And the extent that we react to each other comes from our shared evolutionary history, which we don't have with extraterrestrials. So we have to take a step back and look at convergent evolution and arguments for or against convergence across planetary populations. That was my first job was in the museum that's here, the background of the picture, and when I walked through zoology, which was a little distance from where I worked, I was very impressed, just like Simon Conway Morris, about how incredibly similar the marsupial fauna of Australia is to the placental fauna on other continents. There's an astonishing amount of convergent evolution here, and Conway Morris has expanded that and very carefully documented for lots of animal and plant examples. And he thinks that on this basis there will be quite a bit of convergence across planetary populations. There are certain chemical arguments. There are only so many elements and so many types of chemical bonds that actually can make the molecules that are necessary for organic life to exist. But on the other hand, we do share a very long history of evolution with everything else on Earth. And we should not underestimate the inventiveness of evolution when it has different starting materials, even if they can, for chemical reasons, only be slightly different. So what does this mean for evolutionary psychology? Well, if we have a technological society, then we can, with some plausibility, assume that they are cooperative within their society. What it means for when they encounter aliens, that's not entirely certain, but they will be cooperative, and that cooperation will have both genetic and cultural components. What it does, as far as I can tell, not justify is that if we understand how they behave, that we should infer similar emotions. And I'm told to speed up here. I've made a little visual symbol here of that we don't know what's inside the machine, whether there is a man inside the machine or a machine inside the man or woman, as the case may be. What underlies this picture is that primitive life forms, in order to become communicating organisms, will evolve some neural structure, some equivalent to neural structure, and this will eventually become some organ like a brain. But what goes on inside the brain, it seems to me, is not determined by that evolutionary trajectory. And the suspicion that I have, which may or may not sit too well with the philosophers in the audience, is that we are still thinking in some ways in terms of idealism, that mind, Geist, is something, some property that gets reached and has its own dynamic. And we don't account for the fact that there are maybe things that we cannot imagine that are the equivalent of our mind in aliens, but they are such that we cannot imagine what they are like. Now, is there a minimal context? Well, that's the message itself that we are sending. And Doug has sometime made the proposal to use actually the carrier frequency, if I understand this, as a sort of teaching tool here in terms of Mendelian laws, or it goes on from there to some more complex messages. And these are, using my concluding metaphor, sort of the postage stamp of the message that we can encode in these frequencies. And so we can send a greeting card and hope that extraterrestrials can read it. But if they are so different that they can't, then at least they can admire the stamp, even if they can't understand it. So I'll stop with that and leave the recommendations to the later session.
Thank you very much. Anybody wants to ask a question? 1 second.
Yeah, some years ago, I saw a planetarium show in which they showed the Four Seasons in Montana, no, actually Minnesota. Mm-hmm. And in the background, they played Vivaldi's Four Seasons. And it was narrated by James Kirk, you know, the actor. But I was wondering if the music doesn't somehow get across a little bit our emotion to some phenomenon which aliens may share, the changing of the seasons, for example. Now, that's the only thing I thought of, is just Vivaldi was obviously human, but still it may get across to some extent our emotional reactions to that.
in my day job, I run the largest classical music archives on the internet, so I'm all for that.
Okay, thank you for your... Is it on? Yeah. Thank you for your talk. There's one emotion that they probably would understand. If they are alive, they would understand death. They would understand death if they are alive. So if fear of death would be something they would understand, emotions or
right.
or death.
This is an issue why thinking about the evolution of emotions is hard, because our complex of emotions is to some extent determined by that. Obviously not entirely, but so, you know, what does the realization that our life is finite do to the makeup of our emotions? That's why we have a hard time understanding animals.
Yeah.
You know, they obviously react to the danger, but are they aware that the danger means that they are going to become dead?
So that would be an experience that we share, probably,
Right.
if there are life out there. Another thought that I have is, wouldn't it be easier to show a lack of altruism instead of possessing altruism? For example, if they monitor us, they would see that we have certain problems with altruism. For example, war, global warming, or environmental issues that we are facing.
This is a hard question, and it is to some extent a philosophical issue of whether we are moral dualists or not. You know what I mean? Whether we believe that the lack of altruism is a positive thing that we can express, or that you know, we cannot really send no signal as a signal. You know what I mean? So is that is the moral situation equivalent to that, or is it equivalent to a positive and negative charge? And I think unless we can think about that and discuss it, we won't be able to solve the problem.
So let's put aside the issue of encoding and so on for the moment, and just imagine that you could send pictures that are comprehensible as images, and you wanted to express the idea that one set of images were portraying bad situations, and the other set were portraying good situations. And without making assumptions about motherhood, which I think is a pretty big assumption, how would you indicate that which set was which?
I think that is one problem why there's an intuitive aversion to sending bad situations, because they can be misinterpreted. There is a novel that I have started reading but didn't finish, called The Sparrow, Mary Doria Russell, where you know, it's not just images, it's the people who go there who completely misunderstand the society. So, you know, reverse the situation. Think about we are the alien society for aliens looking at us. We just hope they don't make assumptions about us, or not too many.
How do we help them not to make assumptions?
That I don't know, but maybe there is a way that we can think about it, at least start thinking about it.
I have a few remarks more than precise questions. First of all, when we send a greeting card, we could hope that the intelligence could not take it as the menu of a restaurant. And that leads to the question of the emotion. I think that this is a very important way to try to deal the problem with evolutionary psychology, but that we have to be cautious about the fact that most evolutionary psychologists do not know a lot about anthropology and about cultural differences and about emotion in particular. We must be very cautious about the differences between cultures, and the fact that in every culture we could have emotions of a kind toward some creatures and of another kind toward another kind of creatures. For instance, Amerindians in Amazonia could be very careful about some animals and very distressful about other kind of animals. For instance, they do not like dogs at all, and they are very bad with dog. On the other hand, from the point of view of extraterrestrial civilization, we could be a very bad creature with, for instance, meat farming, industrial farming, which could be the sign of a lack of emotion toward life. Another point is that we assume in that discussion that we will interact with an extraterrestrial living intelligence, which is an assumption that has to be proved. In other words, we could interact with some artifacts, some robots, for instance, that have been built by extraterrestrial civilization to explore cosmos, and that those artifacts have no emotions at all. And so assumptions about the emotions of extraterrestrials could be wrong in case of that contact.
Well, that's, you know, Sam was saying that we are much more likely to communicate with robots or not. Well, there are probably technological arguments in favor of it. My response would be, right now, for the moment, I'm not interested in talking to them. You know, I'm waiting for terrestrial intelligence to evolve where they actually made the kinds of robots so that we have some idea of what they are like. I just think, okay, well, maybe there are robots out there that read the things that we sent them, but I'm not sure that I know that what I told them, you know, because precisely because of that problem, because we assume that there's nothing equivalent to human emotions there. And if that's the correct assumption, then we know exactly as little about them as the kinds of things that have a mind, but something that we wouldn't even call a mind. So the other thing about cultural diversity, that there are two things actually. First of all is, of course, we have to talk to everyone about what they think, even if they, you know, they don't approve of our technology. At least learn about what their cultural ideas are. The other thing is that I skipped over something that was mentioned on one of the slides, but I didn't address. And these are the so-called Spandrels, you know, that comes from Stephen Gould's idea that everything that has evolved, literally practically everything that has evolved, has non-adaptive as well as adaptive features to it. And that comes from just from the evolutionary history, because it's constrained by the chemistry, it's constrained by random directions of evolution and so forth. And so it's very hard to figure out what part of our evolved psychological nature is actually adaptive and not just a byproduct of our social interactions. And that's, you know, a lot of these cultural differences actually interact probably with spandrels rather than adaptive features.
Yes, I'd just like to make a point here in connection with what David said, this preoccupation with the fact that our lives are finite. There's an extensive mathematics of the infinite, where people are just interested in infinite collections and their various properties, and it is very much like theology. I often think the motivation is simply because we're so concerned with the finiteness of our existence that we want to understand what the infinite is like. And in a sense, it's an emotional response to that. You know, perhaps only mathematicians react that way, but it is an emotional response.
Well, yeah, there are a lot of people that claim that Cantor went crazy over that question.
Actually, the only time that I got my mind blown at high school was when the teacher talked about infinity and the infinity of infinities. I actually had this, I basically fainted. When somebody asked me what is my religion, I tell them I am a God-fearing agnostic. And I think that could be a message we could send to the aliens. We are God-fearing agnostic. Either they think we are sophisticated with a sense of humor and they'd like to talk, or they say, these guys need help. We'll be right over. Thank you very much. We'll take a 30 minutes break.